agree, and that makes our friendship so strong. So for me, I wanted to write in this book. I decided to write about the desire that we all have of immortality in the field of humans, and most of all, the immortality in the field of the divine. So for that, we create gods, we create Radha, we create Mahishasura-mardini, we create characters that will help us in this life and that will help us to go inwards in order to find our spirituality, to have the goddess, to have the birthing the goddess inside us. So that is what I write about. So now I let you
say more about what you write. You can't, you have to just say a little bit about that, yes.
I get inspired every time I go somewhere with the images I see and this book, this essay that I wrote, I was inspired with one sarcophagus that is in the museum here in Harvard. It's a beautiful museum that has depicted the Amazonas women, the warriors. So I got inspired in that because these Amazonas were characters that were fiction, but mythology, and still they were very important for the Romans, for the Greeks, and even they were because of them that they became the Amazon, the region of the Amazon, and the river, the important river of the Amazon, became named because of them. Because it was, I tell everything in the story, but we can see how characters, fiction or reality, become heroes, and very often is related with death. A hero often becomes a hero because he dies in order to be reborn like a hero. So I invite you to continue to ask questions.
Built in Peru?
Yes.
I mean, it's an extraordinary thing that we have no idea about before.
Yes, I have been very interested in the Amazon region because we think that it's a pristine place that is the long for the world, but it seems that now with some drones and some very high technology, they discovered that there were a lot of cities, a civilization that was there that knew how to cultivate inside the forest, how to do compost, because if you remove in the tropical forest, you remove the green, it becomes desert, but they knew how to do that. So I was fascinated, and it's a site that is a funerary site, once again, funerary site in order to give, that goes around because the knowledge is spread in a spiral way. So it's in a spiral, and it's very, very fascinating, everything that we can learn from ancient civilization that we thought that they were just not evolved, only because they were not having these seeds, because in the Amazon everything gets rooted. So they knew other ways, and that we can learn from them, I think, now. So thank you.
Thank you, Stella.
I'm a friend of Nilima, Chitgopekar, who is not here tonight. We've known each other for at least 30 years and crossed paths a number of times in India, a number of times here as well. Of course, I've known Diana forever and met Stella a number of times. So I'm very honored to be here, but really Nilima is the starting point for my being part of this conversation tonight. And I think it's of an advantage coming to it from the outside, to the conversation, because it strikes me so powerfully how wonderful it is the way it came together as kind of a community of conversation community of scholarship, talking to one another, producing the first book, Experiencing the Goddess, and now this book, and doing incredible things that I never do, like Zooming each week to have conversations with one another, getting together in India to start talking about the essays, and not imagining simply the words, but also the images, the sculpture, the poetry, and I think reading back and forth each other's essays is a very powerful model of scholarship. The cooperative scholarship that cannot be done by one person, but can be done by a community together. And the result of it is quite amazing. Either book, certainly the second book we have before us tonight, because it weaves together kind of seamlessly scholarship that wears itself lightly. There's not a heavy burden of footnotes, but the scholarship is there. It's deep in the text. Our authors know what they're talking about. They've read the text. They can think them through. And then they do what many of us rarely do, like I rarely do except in classes perhaps, is use images as part of the argument and the story. So not simply pretty illustrations to show points or distract the reader or something like that, but the images are as much communicative as the words. And then the interplay between looking at the images, reading the words, becomes very powerful. And the back and forth. And then quoting poetries from a number of different languages is very important. And then having your own poetry in the volume is very powerful as well. So the ability to be scholarly, knowing the details, bringing in the images, and then daring to speak in one's own voice and bring in one's own poetry in a way that substantively holds together across the essays. That there's a conversation here. I think Stella maybe, or the introduction, makes the point. You could read these essays in any order. They're in a certain order in the book, but they don't have to be read in that direction. But I think the power of it is in the fact that the personal and the scholarly, the verbal and the images are all woven together in a way that however you read the essays, in a sense you have to take the book as a whole and you have to read it as a whole. And so one of the themes, both in the introduction, it comes up a number of times in the essays, is fighting back against the patriarchy and fighting back against ways of doing scholarship about South Asia that erases the female or reduces it to kind of a footnote or puts it over in the margins, and showing in sculpture, in painting, in words, in poetry, in different languages. It's always been there, but we just haven't been allowed to pay attention. And to put it all there is the argument in the book, and I think the two books together started accumulating a very powerful case for imagining our scholarship differently. But I think it also requires a different manner of reading. And I was toying with the idea that may not come true very easily, but as you have a community of writers coming together to write the book, you really need a community of readers to read the book together. And people who are not in the book to sit together, Zoom together from different parts of the world, and go back and forth about what did you see in the book? Which part of it stood out for you? And I can imagine doing this in a class at the Divinity School or South Asia, whatever. But it's so interesting because it's not simply objecting to patriarchy and then asserting a counterpoint, but showing a different way of talking about how we imagine religion, culture, art, how we think about life and death, how we think about birth. All of these things, I think, come together powerfully in the book. So I appreciate all of this very much. And again, just highlight the value of doing it this way, as our authors have done. I'll be very brief because I know there's a lot of people in the room who have a lot to say in conversation. I had a couple of points, one point for each author, really, of the three of you who are here today. And I'll start with Stella. The pursuit of immortality, again, is a theme that has been taken up in many, many books. And the idea of the immortal and the immortal. And yet the way you do it, I think, with the breathtaking range of materials you deal with, from the Amazon, and from the stories of how missionaries came up with the myth of the Amazon women, all the way to different parts of India, to different people in trouble, to landscapes being polluted and destroyed, and showing that there's a kind of hidden immortality in the midst of all the mortality and death around us. And I think the metaphor that comes forth is, as you mentioned, that when people thought, well, either there's nobody living in the Amazon except a few people who are just there for some reason, we don't know why they're there, and then we will come and we will do something productive with it. Those who tried to do something productive messed up the whole thing because they didn't understand the trees, the soil, the ecology. And then to be able to see from the air that incredible numbers of people live there in a harmonious relationship with the soil, and that the civilizations were there until diseases and interference from the West and all that began to ruin everything. To show that, not simply by words, but again by images and the breathtaking story of your travels, your indefatigable travels around the world, bringing that all together to make the case that the immortal is always hidden within the immortal. So I thank you for that. That's very brilliant. And then Anamika, thinking of your essay about Radha in art and text, I suppose I always knew, but never really thought too deeply about where is Radha in the Bhagavata Purana. It is the case, and these other Puranas you mentioned, the Narada, the Matsya Purana, and so on like that, she is there. And what is going on? I think you explained it beautifully tonight, in terms of Krishna needing or not needing her, and the ability for a time to imagine him without her, and then the gradually accumulating case that there has to be her with him. And a text like the Gita Govinda showing this in much more varied and beautiful detail, why she is there. I think again, it's a kind of scholarship that says something but also shows something at the same time, and gets us, people like me, to go back and look at the Bhagavata Purana, book 10 again, and pay attention to what's not there and how important that can be for us. It also reminded me, and this is, I'll do this briefly because it's an aside interest of mine, thinking of how this worked out in the South, in the Tamil context. So you have, among the Alvars, you have one woman Alvar, Andal, and one of the key 12 saints. And in her poetry, clearly she is calling, yearning for marriage with Lord Vishnu, Ranganatha in the temple in Sri Rangam. And yet her role in the Alvars, sometimes the count of them is only 10, and she's not one of them. And other times, she is the number one Alvar, the one that, unless you have her there, you have nothing. And the stories that come up later on, the hagiographies up to the modern times, of the processions taking her to the temple, acting out one of the songs in the Natyar Tiruvori about marrying the Lord in the temple. All that comes to the fore. And I thought also of the, I just read in class with some students, the Sri Gunaratna Kosha, Parashara Bhattar, a Sri Vaishnava text praising the goddess, Sri Lakshmi. And one of the arguments that he makes in there, in poetic form, 61 verses, is that isn't it notable that so many of the ancient texts, such as Vedas and Upanishads, say almost nothing about Lakshmi. But what you have to realize, he says, is she's always hidden in those texts. And that just as when you have a kosha, a treasure chest, you wouldn't simply leave it open and anyone can walk in and look at it and take what they want. You have to earn your keep. You have to earn your way into the secret treasures at the center of a tradition. And that you have to be able, therefore, to learn your way in, to see your way in order to realize that in all the texts where Sri Lakshmi was not present, she actually was present. And this strikes me as interesting because, again, the theme of the agency and the creative power of bringing forth the goddess, and not simply she has a birth story, but she's created. She's being created in places where she didn't need to be created, and yet the urgency grows in the traditions to find her a place, and to find Sri Lakshmi in the Ramanuja tradition of the South, to find Radha in the Gita Govinda. Men as well as women are contributing to this process of opening things up and finding ways. And it's kind of, you might say, a life compulsion toward the birthing. And that despite themselves, figures who are maybe in very traditional roles where women are always behind, are finding themselves more and more necessarily speaking of the divine and feminine principle and bringing that into these heavy-duty Sanskrit texts and something like that. In ways that you wouldn't expect otherwise. So I think, again, I thank you for that, for you showing it for us. And then Seema, with your essay, it made me, read again with a new eye the Hiranyagarbha Sutta in the Rig Veda. So 10.121 in the Rig Veda. I went back and all I had time to do was look off the Jameson Brereton translation of the Rig Veda. And this is a hymn that's innumerably used in classes and so on like that, about the golden embryo. And the fact that it's an embryo, and in most of the translations I know of, and most of the discourses I know about it, even their introduction to the hymn, it's not a womb at all. It's an embryo in the womb. And you realize once you say what you say, that forces one to go back and look at the text that talks about the creative power of the embryo, the golden radiance coming forward and so like that, and realize that it's been there all the time. The sense that the Rig Veda, again, a very old hymn, is showing us her as well as him, and that there's a kind of creative power there that one loses sight of. Of course, that creates a problem for the rest of that sutta, because it's the famous ka hymn, like who? Who are we talking about? Whose name is this? Who are we about? And every verse has a sense that it's, I brought it along actually. Who is the God to whom we should do homage with our oblation?
Om Hiranyagarbha Samavartatagre Bhutasya Jata. We're talking about the Garbha here.
Right.
Om
Yeah,
Hiranyagarbha
and all I'm pointing out is-
Samavartatagre Bhutasya Jata Padireka Asita Sadadhara Prithvim Vyamudema Kasmai Devaya Havisha Videma.
Right.
You know, so it is a question in the end.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That
Yeah.
the question is repeated about 7 times in the hymn.
Yeah.
And the question is disappointingly answered at the end of the hymn, because there's a verse stuck on the end that even Jameson and Brereton think, saying Pradapati.
Yeah.
And it's in a sense disappointing because there was an opportunity there in very ancient times to take the question, to take more richly, as you do in your book, the imagery of the Hiranyagarbha and say, well, don't reduce it to the embryo, but see it in this clearly much more rich form of the womb. And then when you ask the question, make it a real question that doesn't have an answer that you've already prepared in advance. So these are just examples, and I'm sure there'll be much more to talk about how the book, beautifully done, beautifully cooperatively done by our authors, showing us how to write together, see together, how we should read together. Then in each of the essays, I've just given small examples, raise questions for us about rethinking things we thought we knew about Indology, about the Sanskrit, the Tamil texts, and how art and word go together. So for this, I thank you all.
Thank you so much.